white women looked like they had it all: privilege, status, protection. But as many historians will say, this idea wasn't close to the actual reality. During the planter class era, women were not permitted to own property, have voting rights, or hold any office, and when they got married, all they had was transferred to their husbands. The only thing they exercised authority over were slaves, and this they greatly exploited. These elite white women sought supremacy in the affairs of managing black slaves, and since they lacked a valid say in other areas, they often strived to assert their dominance and control over the enslaved population, with a deeply rooted target for enslaved black men. The abuses endured by black men were the most underlooked and poorly documented area of black slavery in the planter class era. However, lots of research, court cases, and documentation provide testimonies that these black male violations were a major wave of enslaved people's human rights abuse that have been meticulously silenced. These are the stories of the untold abuses inflicted on black men by their white slave mistresses. Back in the 1800s, the world was a far different place than it is today. That period in history is commonly referred to as the antebellum era. Antebellum, which is a Latin word meaning before the war, describes a historical timeline that existed between the period of the end of the war in 1812 to the start of the American Civil War in 1861. This era was relevantly marked by the prevalence of slavery and the continuous forceful importation of black people from Africa. During this time, the economy was heavily plantation-based, creating an unquenchable demand for slaves. States in the antebellum South were deemed more powerful as they controlled more wealth, generated by their innumerable slaves, while non-slave states lagged behind in productivity and affluence due to an insufficient labor force. A person's class in a society was grossly determined by the amount of slaves in their possession. Literally, the more slaves you had, the richer and more respected you became. A person who had engaged in southern agriculture and owned at least 20 slaves was qualified as a member of the planter class. This class of individuals owned everything within the region: slaves, political rights, the economy, everything. They were devoted to the production and export of cash crops, including tobacco, cotton, coffee, among others. These plantations were operated by the forced labor of slaves, which they legally owned at that time. White women who were married or associated with families of this caliber were referred to as planter class women. Men of this statute, wielding substantial influence in society, they were involved in major decision-making, political activities, international dealings, and power shuffles. Their wives were nothing more than properties, because aside from the status and protection they gained from their husbands, they played very inactive roles in controlling their very own society. The planter class women were bound by societal expectations of femininity. They were not only required to fulfill their roles as early housewives, but also act as custodians of morality and virtue in their immediate society. They were often seen as fragile, incapable of managing anything without the supervision of their male counterparts, and at risk of external harm. Since they were afforded more time within the domestic sphere, they held controlling power in the context of slavery. They played active roles in the management and perpetuation of the slavery institution, and because this was the only area they were allowed the opportunity to act freely, they greatly exploited it. Women could give orders, issue discipline pertaining to affairs within the plantation. They were far from being passive members in slavery. Despite being denied entitlements like the right to vote and participate in political activities, these women exerted authority over buying, selling, and making major decisions in the slavery institution. The planter class women in the era of slavery often targeted enslaved black men for various reasons, driven by a combination of social, economic, and power dynamics. These elite women wielded an upper arm of dominance over their black slaves. It was said that the planter class women were often neglected by their husbands, who were usually hooked on business trips and travel. These women claimed to be bored, neglected, forgotten, and poorly satisfied sexually. Whether this was part of what drove their motivation or not, they took advantage of their authority over their black males and treated them in a number of distasteful ways. The enslaved black men were subjected to various forms of abuse. They were often coerced into non-consensual sexual relationships and even rape. Life became more complex and daunting for these predated black men who combined working under forced labor with enduring a fearsome coerced sexual relationship with their white female owners, as they had everything to lose. During this era of slavery in the United States, interracial relationships were a taboo. Women were strongly prohibited from participating in such out of fear of the breeding of brown babies and a possible dilution of white purity and supremacy. However, due to the power dynamics and the oppressive system they were trapped in, male slaves were often forced to remain silent about their experiences. The enslaved men faced significant challenges in speaking out against their abuse. Firstly, their position as slaves meant they had no legal rights of protections, making it difficult for them to seek justice or report their experiences. Secondly, the oppressive nature of slavery created an environment of fear and intimidation, where speaking out could lead to severe punishment or even death. William Grimes, a former slave and American writer, in his famous book, The Runaway Slave, recounted his experiences working as a slave boy. Grimes was said to have worked under at least 10 different masters, serving in varied positions including working as a house servant, valet, field worker, stable boy, and coachman. He shared a certain experience where he worked for a certain master whom he simply referred to as Dr. Stewart's. In his words, "Although my master treated me kindly, my mistress hated me. Upon catching me in the house, she beat me until I could hardly stand." In his book, he maintained a frankness about how he was abused throughout his narrative. With his descriptions of his abuse as a slave boy, Grimes stood as a stark critique against the institution of slavery. William Grimes also described a series of assaults he endured from a woman he said was a friend of one of his master's family. He talked about several occasions where he was forced into sexual relations by this woman, which he defined as one of the most humiliating and painful parts of his life. These, plus several other abuses he didn't document, drove him to seek an opportunity to run away. He eventually escaped slavery in 1814 by stowing away on a ship bound for New York. Additionally, the sexual abuse or exploitation of enslaved black men by planter-class women was propagated to reinforce white supremacy and maintain racial control. By exerting sexual dominance over black men, they perpetuated the notion of white superiority and reinforced racial hierarchies. It was a way for these women to exert their power and assert control over the bodies of enslaved individuals. In some other accounts, the planter-class women were said to have engaged in such behavior out of a desire for personal pleasure or as a means of entertainment. The dehumanization of enslaved black men allowed them to be treated as objects for the amusement or satisfaction of their captors. If you know George Washington, you will know he owned a good number of enslaved individuals at his Mount Vernon home, but what most people don't know is that it was his wife, Martha, who dramatically increased the numbers after they got married in 1759. Before the Union, George owned about 18 slaves. Martha, on the other hand, who was one of the richest women in Virginia at the time, had 84 slaves to her name. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, the popular American historian, was compiling a report on just how many white women owned slaves, and in data studied in parts of 1850 and 1860, it was revealed that 40% of slave owners in the United States were white women. In her words, slave-holding parents usually gave their daughters more enslaved people than land. This means a major form of transferable property during the era was enslaved people, and daughters took top priority in this inheritance. Her book, They Were Her Property, came out in 2019 and was the first extensive study of the role of white women in the slave market system. Jones Rogers discovered and went further to state that white women were actually trained to participate in the business of slave management from a tender age. Their exposure to the slave market does not just begin suddenly in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they are little girls, sometimes infants, when they are given enslaved people as presents. Young white children in plantation management training were taught how to punish and inflict pain on enslaved people, regardless of whether the child was too young to handle that experience or not. There was an account of a woman who was given an enslaved person as her own property when she was just 9 9 months old. She grew up and was schooled to understand that she possessed unequivocal authority and control over her human property. Practically, it was not just this woman. This was how things were usually done in the planter class era. This continued in the following years. Mothers passed the culture down to their offspring, preserving the white supremacy and continual inhumane treatment of these enslaved people. As adults, white women were already portraying enormous expertise in demonstrating control over a large number of slaves. It was a role they were born for. Their interests drifted from every other form of responsibility, including breastfeeding their own children. This caused them to turn towards enslaved black women, denying them control over their bodies as they were being forced to take responsibility and breastfeed their white enslavers' babies. This act continued for many years, creating a huge demand for the enslaved women who were commonly referred to as wet nurses. One white woman, Jane Pettigrew, once described her repulsion for breastfeeding and how much of a bother it was for her. She stated she had a distaste for breastfeeding because it made her a slave to her own children. Black men were continually victimized, and those who rebelled or resisted sexual advances from their female owners were blackmailed, set up, and blamed for crimes they did not commit. White female fragility was used to defend the notion that women were weak and incapable of committing crimes or sexually abusing men, and that they needed protection from the lustful sexual advances of black men. White women got away from facing punishments under the law by blaming black men for their crimes, and as these cases were not thoroughly investigated, these black men were arrested, thrown in jail, and in several cases subjected to gruesome punishments like castration, torture, whiplashing, and gruesomely being burnt to death. Numerous other evidences and testimonies identified white women as active and violent participants in the slave market. They operated an entire market for buying and selling slaves in whom they had a vested economic interest. In those times, a large number of slaves made a woman better considered for marriage because properties were usually transferred from the woman to her husband in the event of marriage. Planter class men sought after women with higher slave property to marry. It was in light of this that white women began to fight in court to preserve their legal ownership of enslaved people, and often were more victorious than their husbands. The subject of how black male slaves who suffered abuse at the hands of white women were systematically suppressed and omitted from mainstream historical accounts is illuminated through silenced narratives and resistance. Action was motivated by the need to uphold the carefully crafted image of white femininity and the larger narrative of slavery that placed emphasis on the actions of white male slaveholders. Due to this, the voices of slaves, particularly black male slaves, were frequently ignored or discounted in historical records. Slave narratives that portrayed white women as the offenders were perceived as a threat to the social order at the time because they dared to question the stereotypes of white womanhood and purity. People who speak out or reveal the brutal truths of their lives as slaves risk serious repercussions. Many slave men were reluctant to report the mistreatment they experienced, especially if it involved white women, in order to protect themselves and their loved ones. Furthermore, societal norms and stereotypes surrounding masculinity played a role in silencing the enslaved men. The prevailing belief at the time was that men should be strong, dominant, and in control. Admitting to being a victim of sexual abuse contradicted these ideals and could lead to further social marginalization and mistrust within their communities. The legacy of this sexual abuse during slavery has had lasting impacts on descendants of enslaved men. The silence and lack of acknowledgement of their experiences have contributed to the perpetuation of trauma and the marginalization of black men in society. It is important to recognize that these actions were a product of a deeply entrenched and oppressive system. While not all planter class women or condoned this mistreatment, the overall system of slavery created an environment where such behavior was possible and, in some cases, encouraged.